First off, read the graphic novel. It's great, and whatever I say after this point, the TV series pales in comparison to the graphic novel. A quick note here, I know it will irk some people that I don't call it a comic, and I understand that, but in my opinion it was distributed as a comic at the time, but is now sold exclusively as a graphic novel. It absolutely can be called a comic too, but I will refer to it as a graphic novel. While the graphic novel was better in my eyes, I do think the TV series was excellent. And to discuss why, I will be going to moderate spoilers for all of the media titled Watchmen. That is, the graphic novel, the TV series, and briefly the movie as well. The second half of this video will take a rather different tack, and will serve as a response to a particular quote-unquote review of HBO's Watchmen, and won't contain many spoilers. If you'd like that shorter, mostly spoiler-free video, that will be available in a post on my Patreon page, via the first link in the description. The second half of this video, and the majority of that second, shorter version, will be focused on the question, was the HBO series made for the fans of Watchmen, the graphic novel? For the moment, I want to put that question aside, because the series wasn't perfect, and to my taste, I think it fell short in a few areas. One of the most notable departures from the graphic novel in the Zack Snyder film was how it handled violence. It was glamorous, exciting, and pretty instead of frantic, messy, and horrible. Short, one-sided beatdowns between abhorrent characters became lengthy, choreographed dances of brutality. What was supposed to unsettle now delights, and much of the weight of the narrative was lost as a result. The series Watchmen does not fall into the same trap, but at times is still a bit too flashy for its own good, and it also unfortunately sidesteps the more uncomfortable violence that does occur. An early scene in which one of our would-be heroes, Angela Abar, aka Sister Knight, tortures a white supremacist for information occurs off-screen. Given the implications of this scene and how casually it's accepted by her colleagues, this should be a big deal, but instead it goes a little under the radar. Meanwhile, some of the more traditional action scenes feel a little overdone, and pull away from the real meat of the story. Lady Trieu is interesting on paper, and with some tweaks to the finale, I think she could have been a far more exciting character, but she ultimately falls flat, not least of all due to her connection to another plot thread I found disappointing, that thread being Adrian Veidt's. Adrian Veidt was a major misstep in my eyes. While I find it delightful that they brought back his original costume, it felt to me like they put that costume on a different character. One scene has the 80-something-year-olds catch a bullet in a callback to the graphic novel, and regardless of his athletic prowess when he was younger, it just doesn't make sense for an incredibly smart and athletic, but otherwise regular person to be able to do at 80 what even his younger self wasn't sure he could. He seems to waltz through his scenes as though they were a play, and while that made perfect sense in some of the early scenes, in the later ones, I don't think it did. I understand how this characterization was supposed to point to how detached from humanity he was, but it felt overstated and oversimplified, making him more of a caricature than a character. The finale, though, offered in my eyes the biggest misstep of the series. Where in the graphic novel the would-be heroes could do nothing in the face of Veidt's plan, and he famously allowed himself to monologue only because he'd already enacted his plan, Lady Trieu's plot felt much closer to the standard comic book villain fare, and the whole finale feels rather silly for it. There's also this scene, which takes one of the best characters in the series and gives him this as a final scene.
And you have the audacity of...
That guy talks too much.
The graphic novel had a few cheesy lines too, but this was just bad. While the series does fall short in some areas, and it may sound like I'm quite down on it, it triumphs in others, and in ways that absolutely make up for whatever misgivings I might otherwise have. Angela Abar, or Sister Knight, is one of them. I don't need to heap further praise on Regina King's performance, but it is excellent. Everything about her character is fantastic, and while I was a little disappointed in the lack of involvement of the extended cast, Abar was certainly a character worthy of carrying the narrative, with a few incredible scenes that absolutely made the show. Wade Tillman, or Looking Glass, is equally brilliant. More than any other character, he feels like a very natural extension of the world of the graphic novel, and the episode that focuses on his story is perhaps the closest the series comes to the straight sequel territory some people no doubt expected from the series. Despite a few dud lines towards the end, he was consistently fascinating throughout the series, and a wonderful extension of the world Alan Moore created. Perhaps the biggest surprise for me was Laurie Blake, now going by Laurie Blake. If you've read the graphic novel, you'll understand immediately why her change in name would be so surprising. Taking on the last name of her absolute monster of a father suggests something of a change in her character, and her character in the show ultimately confirms it.
What?
She's as stuck in the past, as caged in by her vigilante friends as ever, but now with a restrained brutality sitting under her smile. If you felt her character was shortchanged in the graphic novel, or especially in the movie, this might just be the Laurie you always wanted to see. I think Hooded Justice might be the whole reason the HBO series was made the way it was. How he was handled was impressive, to say the least, and the recontextualization of his character made for one of the series' show-stopping episodes. Telling the story of the first costume vigilante in this way and for these reasons was an absolute delight. For his story alone, any minor quibbles I might have with the rest of the show all but disappear. Watchmen was fantastic, and it was fantastic specifically because I was a fan of the graphic novel. But if you search for a review of HBO's Watchmen on YouTube, this probably isn't the sentiment you'll see. What you'll likely see are fans attacking the show, mostly based on its first episode and one of the controversial decisions therein, namely taking Rorschach's mask and making it into the equivalent of a clown hood. People hate this decision, and it would be easy for me to dismiss such outrage as the whining of Rorschach fanboys. Fanboys who don't understand that he was always supposed to be a psychopath and a monster, albeit a sympathetic one. It would be easy and probably justified, but instead I'd rather take those arguments at face value, to look at the insult to the fans that the HBO series supposedly was, and ask, why? So who is Watchmen for? Is it an insult to the characters and worlds of the graphic novel? Did it spit in the face of Alan Moore's work? Is Watchmen the TV series for the fans of Watchmen the graphic novel? To hear one of these negative responses is to understand what's going on here.
Unfortunately, Damon Lindelof, being of the school of bad reboot, is all about style and no substance, and is the wrong person to take on anything by Alan Moore.
This one stood out to me because it starts with a line from Alan Moore that I would have thought clearly supported my interpretation of the graphic novel and how the series was an extension of it, in a video that obviously held the opposite opinion.
The most unpleasant character is Rorschach. He almost ends up as the hero of the book. He's certainly the character who seems to have the most ferocious integrity. Even if his politics are completely mad, he has this ferocious moral integrity that has made him one of the most popular characters in the book.
Nerdrotic.com.
Here Alan Moore describes what Rorschach was, a politically and ideologically broken, disturbed man, but one with a fierce conviction and a complete inability to compromise or to identify shades of grey within his moral code. He thinks in terms of black and white, with nothing in between, and is extremely hardline about those views. I thought it was immediately obvious why a bunch of racist extremists might be drawn to his writings and imagery. So even though I would have clicked away from this video within a minute, I watched the whole thing, expecting that at some point that opening quote would be explained. But it wasn't, and I think I know why. Nerdrotic believes that true Watchmen fans will hate this show. And with that in mind, I think we can infer why he chose that Alan Moore quote. He reads it differently to how I read it, and assumes we all read it the same way. Not only do I read this quote differently, I have to assume I also read Watchmen differently. I don't know if I would be considered a true fan, having only read the graphic novel at least 10 times over, and no doubt Nerdrotic is so much more knowledgeable, as only a true fan could be. But if you come out of Watchmen identifying with Rorschach, I'll defer to another Alan Moore quote. I meant him to be a bad example, but I have people coming up to me in the street saying, I am Rorschach, that is my story. And I'll be thinking, yeah, great, can you just keep away from me, never come anywhere near me again as long as I live? I guess I'm just not a true fan, but I think I'd rather side with the creator here, because Rorschach was a monster. Naturally, it follows I loved that the series would opt to have one kind of monster wear another's face, even if they weren't the same kind of monster. Whether Rorschach was or wasn't racist doesn't matter. People would have every reason to believe he was. My love for the series goes well beyond this one decision, of course, but Nerdrotic's channel doesn't seem to go on to even mention Watchmen after this first episode, so for the sake of this video, I'll stop here. Looking at my response next to Nerdrotic's begs the question, which is the response of a real fan? Is it the enthusiasm I might hold for the series despite its missteps, or is it the disdain other fans might have for the faults they saw in the narrative? It's the wrong question. In much the same way that some people were upset by the white supremacists wearing Rorschach masks because they didn't think he was racist, while ignoring the stacks of hard-right and blatantly racist newspapers in his apartment and the undeniable bigotry he demonstrated in his diary, if you focus on this one question, you'll get some strange answers. Rorschach might or might not have been racist, but racists absolutely could, and probably would, co-opt his writings and imagery for their specific beliefs. Whether or not Rorschach was racist is the wrong question. Whether or not racists might identify with his imagery and ideas is the right one. So what of fans then? Why is that the wrong tree to bark up? He asks rhetorically. Well, it's quite simple, and I can illustrate it with this edited passage from Nerdrotic's quote-unquote review of the first episode of Watchmen.
As is tradition with my Rotten Tomatoes videos, it is time to go to you, the people, to hear the real voice of the fan. Love the movie, but this seems like a completely different environment with the Watchmen named attached. Expectations not met. Brett D.
Here, Nerdrotic refers to the audience reactions on Rotten Tomatoes as the real voice of the fan, before almost immediately, without trace of irony, dismissing a positive review without giving any reason for doing so.
5 stars. Incredible first episode. Was very skeptical of any use of the Watchmen not written by Alan Moore, but David Lindelof really seems to get the spirit of the book. Lee, you look like a nice enough guy, and I do believe that David Lindelof captured the spirit of Alan Moore's book as much as Damon Lindelof did, which was not at all.
The really embarrassing part of this video is not just that he decided to dismiss a TV series based on its first episode, nor that he acts as though the fan reactions are where the truth lies, while dismissing fan reactions that don't line up with his own, but rather that he doesn't seem to understand what a fan is at all. It's easy to express your love or hate for an intellectual property or how it has been used, and it's equally easy to believe that your reaction is the correct one. We are all blinded by our own perspectives, after all. What is more difficult, and perhaps uncomfortable, is to understand that fandom is really just the enthusiasm people have for something, and both love and hate are two sides of the same coin. Just as it's wrong for me to dismiss a critical reception of the series because the person in question didn't understand the graphic novel the way I did, it's wrong of Nerdrotic to do the same to positive receptions. That he did so without having the full context of the show is just the cherry on top. Arguably, this video is low-hanging fruit. It's part of a series where Nerdrotic makes angry accusations of woke media ruining nerd fandoms, calls quote-unquote access media biased and full of hypocrisy, and puts on a lisp while reading liberal critics' blurbs.
Barry Hertz from Globe and Mail. Shockingly, this new Watchmen is not only good, not only great, it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, that last part is pretty gross. I have a feeling I know why he puts on this list, and why he seems obsessed with the particular trends in recent media surrounding women and people of colour in leading roles. But I won't say it. Like I said, low-hanging fruit. And hey, in case it wasn't obvious, I'm a lefty, an SJW, a cuck, an NPC, a snowflake, or whatever I'm going to be labelled next. But what I really want to get at here is not Nerdrotic bad, me good. It's not a moral argument I'm trying to make here, but rather one that argues fandom is not merely the one thing. In one of my favourite videos I've made, on being a fan, linked via the card above, I tried to point out the links between genuine love and enthusiasm for something and the darker, more hateful flip side of that same love, making a hard left turn to compare fandom at its most toxic to racism and nationalism. What I really want to point out here is that I'm no more or less a fan of Watchmen than Nerdrotic. What I am is aware that fandom is not always about celebrating what you love. It's also often a negative expression of excluding what you don't. I love Watchmen. I loved this take on Watchmen too, and I didn't love this one. In a perfect world, all of these statements would have nothing to do with each other. I would judge each of these three works in much the same way I judge books from different authors, or albums from different artists. But I don't, and didn't judge these three takes on Watchmen in this way. I'm a fan of this Watchmen, which partially informs what I disliked about this Watchmen, and what I liked about this one. Nerdrotic is presumably also a fan, but clearly what he loves about Watchmen the graphic novel is different to what I loved in it. It disappoints me that he would cite his fandom of something I love as a reason to hate something I also love, but that too is fandom. So is this take on Watchmen for the fans of that Watchmen? Like I said, it's the wrong question. The right one is which fans is it for? Are you a fan of the graphic novel and its characters to the exclusion of its distinctly political messages and the criticisms it makes of those characters? Well, perhaps you won't like the show. There's plenty to love outside of its politics, such as the fantastic soundtrack, but if you don't think, racism is bad and understand that real-life police forces have roots in the Ku Klux Klan and other hate groups, this series isn't made for you. Or, at the least, isn't made for you to enjoy. If, on the other hand, it was the world of Watchmen and the critiques of the political ideas behind each of the would-be heroes that endeared you to the original, I think there's a lot to love here. Of course, that's just my position. I'd love to hear what you think. Was HBO's Watchmen a pleasant surprise or a letdown? Are you as surprised as I was it was made in the way it was, given I doubt anyone could possibly follow what was happening in it if you hadn't read the graphic novel? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks, as always, go to my patrons at patreon.com/varioushorses. Patrons receive updates, behind-the-scenes information, and director's notes on finished videos, as well as occasional pieces of original music. Without their support, these videos would be fewer and further between. As always, cheers. Have a good one.